Okay, we're going to get started with our panelists who are here. Um, I will open, of course, but we have two panelists here. We're waiting for one person who's having a little trouble logging on right now. And I'm going to make sure they have the link that they need. But let's go ahead and begin. So I want to thank you all for joining us. Our next panel discussion is called Voting Accessibility and the Disability Community. Our panelist, if everyone does get logged in today, will be Renaldo Fowler, who's Arizona Disability Law Center, in lieu of Marlene Sayo from the National Disability Rights Center, who had a medical issue that's going to prevent her from being with us today. We have Michelle Bishop, and then we also are scheduled to have Adrian Fuentes, the Arizona Secretary of State, join us, as well as a young voter from Iowa named Edgar Zuniga. I'm sorry, not Iowa, but Idaho. Edward Zuniga, who's a member of the Idaho Disabilities Council. He's the one having a little bit of trouble getting on. So this discussion really ultimately is about some of the stuff that we alluded to in the first panel discussion, speaking to barriers to accessibility for people with disabilities, and particularly in this context of whatever your political persuasion, it is a fact that there have been literally hundreds of bills that have been proposed, and many of which have passed around the country that have made it more difficult to vote than in the past. And so I want our panelists to kind of speak to those issues. In particular, we know that a number of activist organizations and advocacy groups have spoken to the fact that it's very often communities of color who are being impacted by these new restrictions, but also young people, in some cases women, and then logically also people with disabilities. As we open up here, one example that I have is right off the top of my head is that in Houston a couple of years ago during the pandemic, Houston, the county, Harris County, created drive-through voting, and so made it possible for people to literally drive through and not have to get out of the car and not to worry about contracting COVID, because of voting restrictions that were passed soon after that. That was outlawed. And if you can imagine, for someone with a disability who didn't vote early but wants to go in person, but may have mobility issues, being able to drive through was a godsend. So the fallout of those voter restrictions hit them in particular. So now I'd like to just go ahead and introduce our guest, those who are here right now, and I'm sure a couple of other folks will sign on. So first, Renaldo Fowler is with the Arizona Disability Law Center. I'm sorry, it has a new name, Disability Rights Center, and you can please update me on that. I see here on my list that I have the old title, Renaldo, as well as Michelle Bishop. But let's, Renaldo, if you could open by talking about your organization. Give me the correct name, because I have the old one here on my list. And talk to me about the work that you've been doing and your organization has been doing in the state of Arizona, which has certainly been a center, kind of ground zero on so many voting rights issues in the last few years in the context of national politics, regional politics, and the fact that this has become increasingly a swing state. So I'll let you begin, Renaldo.
Okay. Well, thank you, James, for inviting me. My name is Renaldo Fowler. I'm the Senior Staff Advocate with Disability Rights Arizona. We recently changed our name to come in line with most of our sister organizations across the United States. The first thing I want to say, there's a disability rights organization in each state and territory. So if you live in California, it's Disability Rights California, Disability Rights Michigan, and Michelle can speak more about that. What I want to do today, just to let everyone know, elections are run at the state and county levels. And so what I'm going to talk about is some of the things that we're doing in Arizona. And I would encourage you to reach out to your election officials in your states or your disability rights organizations that it is in your state. As James mentioned, in Arizona has, yes, been a real focus area around voting. But I would say this to everyone that for the last number of years, the Arizona Disability Rights Arizona and our Disability Voter Coalition groups have worked real hard with our election officials to address a variety of issues. As James mentioned, during the pandemic, we work with our election officials, especially in Maricopa County. I do believe our secretary will be joining us to speak about that. But when he was recorded at that time, we really worked hard to expanding voting opportunities in Maricopa County. They made it available for people during the pandemic to vote by video phones. And so some of the things that we really worked on, many of our counties in Arizona have curbside voting. The majority of citizens in Arizona, we vote by mail. Sometimes 80% of our voters, we vote by mail. So each state is unique in terms of the challenges that voters with disabilities face. And so, you're dealing with the typical making sure polling places are accessible, poll workers are trained and understand disability etiquette, making sure that the election equipment is on and working. These are issues that we will continue to work with our election officials. I think the thing that most concerning that we have that has really been brought to our attention by our election officials in Arizona, since Arizona is a swing state, a lot of focus is going to be on Arizona. That includes misinformation. One of the things that our Secretary of State has done real well is to inform us about some of the key issues around the selection that's coming up. Number one, misinformation, disinformation, using artificial intelligence to provide wrong information, to mislead people. We've worked quite a bit with our Secretary of State's office, security staff, on reaching out to voters with disabilities. We've done a number of workshops. We have some coming up around misinformation. This misinformation is going to be very sophisticated. Voters with disabilities disproportionately use quite a bit of social media. They're going to be targeting social media, providing what kind of information that's going to be there. It could be information saying polling locations have changed, vote centers have changed, or they changed hours, or just all kinds of information that may go out there to mislead the voter prior to voting. So that's one of the biggest areas that we're concerned in Arizona around misinformation, disinformation, influencing voters with disabilities, and also just underserved communities. I do believe that they're going to have some disproportionate impact on communities of color. Number two, issue that's been identified in Arizona is voter intimidation. In Arizona, we have the right to open carry weapons in certain ways. Some of the challenges that we had during our election is individuals hanging around polling locations, drop boxes. We have drop boxes in Arizona, taking pictures of people's cars and making comments. And so that's a pretty scary situation if you're going to try to exercise your right to vote. You have to deal with those particular issues. But as I mentioned, our Secretary of State, our security folks, our law enforcement people in Arizona are very familiar with what's going on around this particular issues. And so those are really kind of the hot issues around this coming election. Yes, we're going to continue to have, issues around accessible voting. Yes, but misinformation, intimidation, those are some of the concerns that we see in Arizona.
Great. Let's go to Michelle. Michelle, if you could speak to your organization in terms of its big picture view, because obviously you're connected with organizations all across the country. So talk about certainly the work you do. It's not exclusively voting, but speak to the work that you do. But also then, if you could segue into this conversation that we've been having that actually kind of started in the last panel discussion about voting accessibility and the fact that there have been a number of laws that have passed and that have restricted voting, et cetera, et cetera. What are you seeing out there in terms of the landscape.
Absolutely. I'm happy to talk about that. Thank you so much for having me. And Marlene Asayo, our executive director, sends her apologies that she wasn't able to join today. She really wanted to be here. I know she really loves this event and was excited about it. So if you're not familiar with NDRN, the National Disability Rights Network, we are based in Washington, D.C., which is why if you can see me on camera, you can see lovely Washington, D.C. behind me. That is the very glamorous backside of Union Station where buses go in and out all day and make a lot of noise. My name is Michelle Bishop. I'm the manager for voter access and engagement here. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a white woman with curly brown hair and black plastic rim glasses. That's how you can always recognize me. I'm so excited to join today to tell you a little bit about NDRN for those who don't know us. We are a national membership association for organizations like Disability Rights Arizona. They are actually federally mandated. The network was created by Congress. So there are organizations like Disability Rights Arizona in each of the 50 states, each of the 5 US territories, the District of Columbia, and a 57th in the Southwest that's specifically the Native American Disability Law Center. So wherever you are, we have an organization. A lot of them are called disability rights these days. Indiana Disability Rights Ohio. There's a few disability law centers like Utah, Massachusetts. There's a disability law Colorado. A couple still use protection and advocacy, or P&A. If you're in Missouri, there's a Missouri P&A, and there's a couple that have oddball names that don't fit any of those models. There is an Equip for Equality in Illinois and Georgia Advocacy Office in Georgia. You can always go to ndrn.org, and at the top there is a Find Your P&A link where you can look up your state or territory and find who we are wherever you are. So as was mentioned, our network is broader than just the vote. That's my thing. I love talking about voting and access to the vote. I could do it all day long. Actually, I do that all day long. But our work really was rooted in the movement towards deinstitutionalization that really took off in the 1970s. And so the core of our work has actually always been monitoring for abuse and neglect, particularly in institutional settings. We have grown so much from there, and P&As are doing work on any number of issues, including enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act, accessible transportation, affordable accessible housing, access to employment, education, disabled veterans issues, any number of things. I sometimes loosely describe the P&As as being like a legal aid for people with disabilities, because we do have a number of attorneys in our network and they're actually able to represent people with disabilities or to actually sue state and local governments when they do find instances of abuse and neglect. But our work around voting actually is mostly rooted in the Help America Vote Act of 2002, that major piece of legislation that addressed the debacle around the 2000 election, where we had all the Chads. There was the hanging Chads, the pregnant Chads, and all the Chads in Florida, and they weren't sure how voters intended to mark their ballots. That piece of legislation includes a lot more than just getting rid of those punch card machines. It included adding accessible voting machines, which is why a lot of times now you see like a touchscreen machine. It's much easier to use. Created the Election Assistance Commission, and it also created a mandate for our network to work on access to the vote for people with disabilities, which is something that they're doing all the time, which can include talking directly to people with disabilities about getting registered, making your plan to vote, why it matters, what your rights are when you go to vote, working with elections officials themselves. As Renaldo said, elections are mostly state and local, working with those folks to make sure that they're making good decisions, picking accessible polling places, picking good voting equipment, training their poll workers well, any number of things. My role in all of that is really to support the work that they're doing and provide training and technical assistance. So that big, broad view actually is not all that different than what Renaldo discussed to get us kicked off. We do always see some of the traditional barriers that I think folks think of when they think about access to the vote. Less than half of America's polling places are actually compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. We still see doors that are too heavy that aren't propped open, parking lots that don't have enough accessible parking spaces, stairs and no ramp, some of those really traditional barriers that we think of, as well as those accessible voting machines maybe haven't been set up and turned on for use. The poll workers haven't been trained on them very well. They don't have the headphones out for people who need to use an audio ballot. Some of those types of traditional barriers we continue to see. We're working on it all the time, but we've found that access is very much a moving target. And once we solve one problem, another one arises. Elections officials change, polling places change. So it's a constant. There's probably no endpoint to making traditional voting accessible. We've been working a lot on vote by mail and absentee voting, which really became a rock star because of the COVID pandemic and coinciding with a presidential election in 2020. And it really put a spotlight on the fact that vote by mail is not particularly accessible to people with disabilities. It really traditionally requires that you can read and mark and handle paper, which a lot of folks with disabilities can't do. But a number of states have introduced sending those ballots to people electronically and letting them use the assistive technology that they need to be able to mark them. We're absolutely concerned about the misinformation and disinformation that Renaldo talked about, and that voters with disabilities are sometimes at a disadvantage for spotting AI deepfakes that are giving them misinformation online. We do continue actually to worry about COVID-19 since the numbers have gone up a little bit in certain parts of the country. Voters who are immunocompromised or have underlying health conditions, I think probably still need to be concerned about how they're going to be able to vote and do it safely in a way that won't open them up to the risk of COVID-19. We're also thinking a lot about people with disabilities who live in long-term care facilities and residential facilities and how they're accessing the vote, as well as voters in jails and prisons who are eligible to vote, because unless elections officials are going in to all of those settings to make sure that all the residents are able to vote, we often find that their access to the vote can be really tenuous and rely a lot on friends and family to be able to assist them. That actually, I'll make one last point then, because it made me think of one more thing. We're also seeing in a number of states new laws that would restrict who can assist you as a voter with a disability. This is something that's protected by federal law. It's in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that you have the right to the assistant of your choice. The only limitations on that it can't be your employer or your union representative. Otherwise, it doesn't have to be someone who's a citizen or over 18 or registered to vote or planning on voting that day. It doesn't have to be their polling place. It's whoever you trust to assist you with your ballot. And we're seeing state laws that attempt to say, you know, it has to be a friend or family member, or it can't be staff in your nursing home, or things like that, that they're just not allowed to further limit that right, and are really having to push back on some of that and let states know that this is a federally protected right. So it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of what we're seeing since the 2020 election. We've seen a record amount of legislation introduced in the states, and some of it will really expand access for voters, especially those with disabilities. And some of it might restrict some of the really positive things we saw in 2020 that were done on the fly in response to the pandemic that made voting more accessible. So 2024 is in many ways an unprecedented election. And in many ways, a lot of the issues that we've continued to see every election cycle for a number of years. But I'm happy to talk about any of that in more detail.
Hey, Michelle, so it looks like James dropped off. He's going to be back on in a little bit.
You know, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I was going to say, should Renaldo and I just keep chatting?
Yeah, let's just go ahead and keep chatting. I'm not able to get on video. It won't let me get on video. But, you know, as Michelle mentioned, one of the things that they recently in Arizona, you know, we just had a decision about citizenship, proof of citizenship. And so it's separate from disabilities, but it may have an impact. Again, what we talked about, making it more difficult for people to register to vote and participate in the electoral process. And one of the concerns, you know, it's such a recent decision, it's real unclear, you know, how does that impact voters today, right? getting registered to vote. In Arizona, we have this, state-only registration. If you don't have ID, then we have federal for federal election. And it's very confusing for voters in general. Imagine if you're a person with a disability trying to understand this process. And so one of the things that we constantly see how these changes continue to impact voters with disabilities. As Michelle mentioned, Arizona, yes, we vote disproportionately very high. We've voted for over a quarter of a century by mail in Arizona. However, we do not have accessible mail return ballots. What does that mean? That means that the state will send you an electronic version, but you have to print it off, have someone to assist you to complete that ballot. That's not a private or independent vote. So you have the blind and low vision community pushing real hard on making sure that the technology is there where they can receive their ballot electronically, use their technology to complete it independently, and return that ballot independently. So you have all of these different avenues that are impacting the general population and voting, but you're also having elections reduce voting options. Moving away from, in Arizona, we've had curbside voting in Arizona. It's available in most counties in Arizona, but there are some counties we're trying to reduce curbside voting in Arizona. One of the things we talked about expanding in Arizona, we have called the Special Election Board. Those are two individuals from two different political parties that can come to your home or your job and help you cast a ballot, or also assist you in voter registration. And so as we take a look at these different voting options out there, the concerns that we have, it makes it more difficult for voters with disabilities. I think the thing that bothers me really is a lot of our veterans who, as they get older or sustain an injury through their military services, either visual or physical or whatever type of injury that they have, and you make it more difficult for them to vote. So those are the concerns that I have, is when you have an impact on all voters, but especially when you have veterans out there as they age or through military injury who may need assistance to vote, and you're making it more challenging for those vets. Those are the concerns that I have. And I see, James, you have joined us. So
yeah, I'm so sorry. I did switch internet services recently, and I think I'm paying the price now. So, but I will. One thought that comes to mind is,
Oh no, I think he froze. It is the new internet.
okay. Well, Michelle, you want to go ahead and jump on and we just continue the conversation?
Absolutely. I see Armando came up as well. If you had anything you wanted to add to that as well.
First I want to thank everybody, and I'm jumping in it looks like James has some technical issues, so I'll be here as a backup, but go ahead and continue that conversation. And Renaldo, good to see you, sir.
Yes, good to see you.
Great to see you. So I'll be here as a backup. So I think you were going to make some comments, Michelle.
Yeah, one of the things that Renaldo was talking about in terms of states that require this proof of citizenship is that there's also a number of ways in which this is done in different states. For instance, there are states that have laws that require that you have a photo ID to be able to vote. And they really require sometimes some interesting things to be able to get that photo ID, like a birth certificate. A birth certificate that was, issued in the United States, or issued with like the seal of the particular, a raised seal of whatever state you were born in on it. And that's not something that everyone has. First of all, you don't have to be born in the United States to be eligible to vote. If you have your citizenship, your naturalized citizenship, you are eligible to vote, and you're not going to have a birth certificate from the United States or that has some sort of, raised seal of the state of California or something like that on it. But there are plenty of people who are also born inside the United States who do not have an original birth certificate. I would imagine, Renaldo, that's something you see a lot in Arizona,
Yeah.
where that may not have been or may not still be common practice on some of the Native American reservations.
Yeah. And you know, one of the things, Michelle, along those lines is one of the things there's an organization called Vote Writers, right? So around ID and documents that you need to get to register to vote and cast a vote. So we've partnered with Vote Writers, which is a national nonpartisan organization who really focus on assisting individuals to get the IDs that they need, the ID that they need to register to vote and to cast their vote. And so that's an actual free service and it's nonpartisan. And so one of the things that we're constantly facing, recently, but the uptick in Arizona is some of these laws around citizenship, some of these laws around ID, and some of these laws around who can assist you with taking your ballot. We have a voting harvesting law. So we have all of these laws that are out there. And the thing that is difficult for voters with disability is to trying to wade through all these particular laws. And so one of the things that I'm going to talk about, some of the things that we've done in Arizona that maybe some other states can do to try to address some of these particular issues is we've really focused a lot around voter education, getting that information out and bringing in different experts in different areas. One of the things that we have an event coming up in Arizona on the 26th, and we're going to talk about a whole day around topics around voting. Number one, we're just going to talk about a basic, understanding your voting rights in Arizona. What are some of the basic things to know about voting in Arizona? Number two, as George Garcia mentioned in a previous presentation, about supportive decision making. So we're going to have a section on supportive decision making, focusing around maintaining your right to vote. Okay. The third session is going to be presented by the Secretary of State's office, someone from their security division there, talk about misinformation, disinformation, artificial intelligence. And the final session is Arizona is a state that we have a lot of propositions and initiatives on the ballot. And so we have someone from Arizona Citizens Cleaning Elections, voter education persons coming in. It's going to educate the community about initiatives and propositions, kind of what they mean, because sometimes we talk with our election officials. This is an issue across the country, is getting things in plain language, not just for voters with disabilities, but just the general population. Sometimes I'll read these propositions, and I do this for a living. I'm trying to figure out what the proposition, if I vote no, what does it really mean? If I vote yes, what does it really mean? And so some of these things that we try to address through education until they make plain language more uniform. So Michelle, you want to jump in? And James, I see that you're back, Michelle, if there's something you want to add to it.
I'll add something quickly and then pass to James. I was like nodding vigorously while you were talking because I do this for a living and I still access plain language translations to understand some of the ballot measures on my ballot, like exactly what you said, vote yes or no on Proposition A. And then there's this big paragraph written in legalese on my ballot and I have no idea what it means. So I agree with, and the other thing that struck me about plain language is that we do a lot of work in partnership with organizations that work with language minority communities. And plain language leads to better language translations as well. So that if you have a jurisdiction that's translating their materials into Spanish, and there are jurisdictions that have to translate their materials into 12 different languages. If they're using plain language for their English materials, they're getting apparently better translations in all the different languages that they may have to put their materials in, which I find found really interesting as well as we started digging into that work. But James, sorry, please take it away if you have any questions for us or anything we should focus on.
I'm the one that should apologize, but thank you so much for carrying on, if you will. I want to go back earlier to, you had listed a kind of a number of barriers and kind of obstacles, Michelle, for people with disabilities. And it sounds to me as if many of those, the ADA should apply. but it's not being enforced. Talk about that, the fact that so many places to go and vote are just inaccessible. And why is that if it's a public building, for instance?
That's an excellent point. And I think you already said probably the most important thing in that conversation is that the ADA is incredibly powerful. It is very specific on what accessibility means, and it's very enforceable, but it has to be enforced. And that actually is a massive task. And accessibility is so widespread. A lot of the enforcement is done directly through the Department of Justice, who have only so many resources to tackle only so many jurisdictions in a given year. And it also relies on, individual voters filing complaints to the Department of Justice, which is very easy to do. You should absolutely do that and share that link with any voters that you have contact with, or with individual lawsuits, which then relies on members of our community having the time and the resources to do that, which is just not necessarily feasible. But when we talk about elections, there's a couple ways in which it just becomes really tricky. Really common polling places are places that other days of the year aren't necessarily covered by the ADA. Churches are extremely common polling places. Under normal conditions, they are actually exempted from the ADA, but when they serve as a polling place, they need to meet the ADA regs and be accessible. So then you're looking at taking an inaccessible location and we're trying to adapt it, right? We're using, temporary signage and traffic cones to make accessible parking spaces, and we're putting down portable ramps, and we're propping open heavy doors. Schools are covered by the ADA, but if school is in session and the students are there, then sometimes we only get to use one part of the school, and does it have a good parking lot, and does it have an accessible path of travel? And schools tend to have like these heavy fire safe doors, and they're not allowed to prop them open, especially if there's little kids, right? We hear from a lot of folks that this is like an elementary school, and the school administrators are saying, we can't prop the doors open, kids will run out the door, right? So you get into all these different, like, conflicting, right? Are we going to follow the ADA, or are we going to follow fire codes, right? When we talk about schools. And in some parts of the country, I wonder if you ever see this, Renaldo, where you are, in some parts of the country, it's actually common to use people's private homes as polling places. It's in somebody's house or like in somebody's garage, which is definitely not regulated by the ADA, but it does have to comply when it's a polling place. So hopefully we're seeing, a driveway that's stable, firm, and slip resistant and not too steep, and they've got like a garage door rolled up and the garage is cleared out or something like that. So maybe we're looking at a more accessible location. But it's a big part of it is that when the rubber meets the road, it's actually quite complicated. We get whatever locations are willing to serve as polling places and have to make it work. Actually, Arizona sees a lot of this. You all have some really interesting polling places, and then the challenge of adapting them. It's actually a really fascinating example.
Yeah, Michelle, you're correct.
Yeah, Renaldo, talk about that.
Okay, so you're correct, Michelle. So what happens? We don't see voting in people's houses, but what we do in Arizona is, and it's done by county. We have 15 counties. Okay, so the two most populated counties use vote centers, right? We don't have precincts. So in Maricopa County, majority of what we do at the bigger elections, small elections, they do mail, but we usually for statewide and big elections, we have vote centers. So if you live anywhere in the county, you can vote at any vote center. We've done this in Maricopa County for years. Pima County within the last election cycle have shifted towards vote centers. But some of our other counties have a combination of both, and some have precincts, okay? So if you look at, as Michelle mentioned, polling locations of vote centers can be churches, many more in churches, right? A lot more at schools, and a lot more at private locations, right? And so you have that. But then again, in Arizona, we have some unique challenges with certain communities traditionally don't pave a lot of parking lots due to a lot of culture implications, okay? So that county does a lot of temporary fixes. We do a lot of temporary fixes on different facilities, different parts of the state to make them temporary accessible, temporary sidewalks, door handles. So we do a lot of those particular types of things in Arizona in terms of making polling locations accessible. Some of the complaints that we get around accessibility is when we have curbside voting in Arizona, you pull up, you either mash a button and someone will come out from, the special election board to help you vote. But if that device isn't working, right, or that accessible polling location is blocked by another car, that's a common issue that we see is inadequate parking, and especially if they block that curbside voting. And so what you do around accessible voting is the challenges in Arizona, depends on where you live in the state, and also due to our large landmass and big gaps between communities, some people have to drive 60 miles to their nearest polling location. That's just the way it is sometimes in Arizona, due to the size of the state.
So on the, I would imagine, Renaldo, that a lot of the churches just have no idea that if they're going to be used as a polling place, that the ADA applies that day. I mean, is it sometimes just as simple as that they're not being
Well, James, it's the election officials
informed?
to select those polling locations to make those facilities accessible. Does that make sense? So
So they should be telling them.
Election officials know what their jobs are.
Right.
Elections officials, yeah, they should be having that conversation with those churches, but also they can't necessarily force the church to spend their money. Like, you got to build a ramp here or whatever. The elections officials kind of are responsible for doing it themselves, like Renaldo said. So sometimes we see temporary solutions, portable ramps and that sort of thing. The other thing that's interesting about churches when we look at kind of the intersection of disability and other communities is that sometimes those are very meaningful polling places. Our organization in Alabama went through this, where there was a rural Alabama community that had a very inaccessible polling place, but it happened to be a very important historic Black church in Alabama, where there were a lot of people of color who voted, and it meant something to them to vote in that church that was a part of the civil rights movement in Alabama. Alabama is such an important state in the civil rights movement. It's meaningful to them. So moving it kind of culturally is meaningful, right? You don't want to move it if you don't have to, especially in a rural area where another location might be really far away. Interestingly, what they were able to do there was to get some lumber donated and to get I kid you not, a Carpenters for Christ group to come in and donate their labor, and they built a permanent ramp on that church for free. And it solves the problem of who's responsible for this, who's going to pay for this, and can an elections official come in and start pouring cement at a church that they don't have ownership of, and some of those kind of legal gray areas.
Hey, James, it does get very complex, especially on some of the nations in Arizona. It gets very complex that election officials work with tribal governments, okay? And a partnership, and some of the locations may not necessarily be accessible, but they have to work with tribal governments. So sometimes it's just like, we're not going to do it. Sometimes there are some complexities of running the elections in certain communities and certain locations. And so we just kind of want to make sure that that's real clear as we have this conversation.
I want to come back to a couple of these issues, but would like to introduce Edgar Zuniga, who's in Idaho, a young voter. Edgar, if you could turn your camera on for us, if possible, and your mic. But I'd like you to talk about some of the work that you do there, and speak to some of these issues if you're seeing this firsthand, some of these issues that are coming up for voters in general, particularly since young voters are expected to be such an integral part of this election.
I would like to share that when I first started voting, I was at a celebration church, and that's where I cast a ballot. What I did was I had a sighted person come and help me or go with me to vote, and they will ask me questions like who you're gonna vote for, and what's really not accessible for me was that when there's people who are visually impaired that that they struggle to use um a technology or like a machine that you can cast your ballots. And so what the struggles that we're facing um is that there's people that are not who cannot see that they have struggled to vote. Um what my organization is doing is they discuss where to vote, what locations they have. Because in my county, I have in Kenyon County, I have I think there's a polling place which is the Celebration Church. It's in Nampa, and that's where I go and cast my ballots and stuff like that. And I usually go with a sighted person to help me since I have a hard time voting by myself. And so what I do is they ask me questions and I vote what to look what like so let's say for example like which president is going to be there or who's going to be president and stuff like that. So um
Let me ask,
what
let me ask Edgar really just briefly in terms of the
mm,
Idaho Disabilities Council.
mhm,
Are you hearing from other people with disabilities, whether it's seeing impaired or some other
mhm.
mobility issue? Are they speaking about these issues and are they finding it more difficult these days to cast a ballot? What are you hearing from your members?
What I hear is registering to vote, like it's harder for them to register an with an ID, or sometimes they make different laws where it makes it harder or not accessible for them. And what they're struggling is that um whether if it's like they had to like find somebody who could help them and then what they wanted to have is like a proof of where you live and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So
Hmm. Proof of
and
residence. Yeah.
yeah, like a residence print, yeah. And
Yeah.
so it and then an ID, which is it's logical. We have for us we have like an ID issued of our state, and so um what I noticed, what the issues we're going through is that um I think most likely just have like a um what to my understanding is that they some people were struggling without a screen reader or with a um or people who are nonverbal too.
Hmm. Let me go back to you, Michelle, if I can, for a moment. You talked about electronic voting. Um, uh, I have often thought this. I can get my driver's license online. I can apply for credit. I can sign a mortgage document electronic. Why can't we vote easily electronically in most states?
Okay, there is one big concern around that. Well, I'll say yeah, one. I'd say one big concern around that is that the thought is that because your ballot is secret, that if it got tampered with, you're less likely to catch it, right? If I do my banking from my smartphone, but if someone went into my bank account and took all my money, I would notice and report it. And I might not catch it if they steal my vote. So there's a little more concern around making sure we can secure it well than there is around other types of things, which actually seems silly now that we talk about it, because we should probably be securing all of those things better, right? We put everything online really fast without thinking about securing it first. So now there's this movement towards, wait a minute, we gotta step back and make sure we can secure these things. But if I'm being honest, this is something that's already being done. Military and overseas voters are already have the right to receive and mark their ballot electronically, and they have different return options in different states, which involve maybe an online web portal, it might be emailing it might be faxing it, which includes e-fax, right? Which is really just at this point a type of electronic return. So this is something that's already being done. And even if there are ongoing security concerns, the logic is that military and overseas voters aren't going to be able to vote at all if we don't make an exception for them. And so we have to do the same thing for people with disabilities, because people with print disabilities who can't use paper for whatever reason, maybe you're blind or low vision, so you can't read or mark it. You have limited use of your hands, so you can't handle the paper or mark it with a pen. You have different types of learning disabilities for which the electronics, you can use your assistive technology that makes it easier to read and to mark. For those voters, we have to be able to make the same exception, to say, maybe there's some risk here, which I think is debatable. I don't know that we've seen attacks of this kind. Maybe there's some risk here, but we have to allow a calculated amount of risk to make sure that no voters are getting disenfranchised. And we have to be willing to do that for people with disabilities as well. And we are seeing that increasingly for one very important reason that you mentioned before. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a very powerful piece of legislation that just needs to be enforced. And if your vote by mail system is exclusively, we're going to mail you a piece of paper and you have to be able to handle it and mark it and mail it back, you're violating the Americans with Disabilities Act. That is not accessible to people with disabilities. And we've seen litigation in some states that have said, you've got to take this electronic system that you have and open it up to people with disabilities, or otherwise it is a violation of federal law. So we've seen it used increasingly over the last several years.
There are some states that,
absolutely.
Is that correct?
There are a number of states where you can receive it and mark it electronically, and you might have to print it and return it that way, which introduces some inaccessibility back into the system. But there are a number of states where you can receive it, mark it, and return it fully electronic, no paper. And it just makes it work so much better for people with disabilities. Sorry, Renaldo, go for it.
No, but Michelle's right. There are states that allow you to return your ballot using your technology. Now, my question I have, for those who have security concerns, I would love to see what those states, any security concerns that they've had since they've been running those elections. So you do have some type of a sample from those states to say, okay, we've had this return, like, accessible ballot by return for the last 2 or 3 cycles or number of years, and we've not seen any issues in terms of security. The technology is out there, but as Michelle mentioned, there are, it was interesting, we used to move towards making voting easier in Arizona, right? Voting by mail, doing some different things that we can always improve it, to now restricting people's right to vote and under the auspice of security. There are security concerns around voting, but you have to have that conversation, honest conversation. And voters with disabilities, have a right to a private and independent vote. And so far, having somebody help you out with your ballot, complete your ballot, it's not private. Yes, you can take someone with you if you choose, but if you choose not to, you should be able to use the equipment, and that equipment should be working. And people who work that equipment should know how to work that equipment. And so these are some of the things we continue to see at sounds like at different levels throughout the country.
Are there, Michelle, states that are doing a better job of understanding that the ramifications of voting restrictions have a ripple effect within the disability community? Are some doing, I imagine some are doing a better job than others, and some are not doing a great job. Who are those folks out there?
I get that question a lot, and it's really interesting because any state I can think of is doing a really good job over here, but could be doing a better job over here. And so it's really, every state is a kind of a mixed bag of, maybe they have a really accessible vote by mail system. It's fully electronic. They're letting people with disabilities use it. but are they doing a good job of training their poll workers so that people who go to vote in person are having an experience where the accommodation they're entitled to is being provided when they go to vote in person? Or maybe they have really great policies for their in-person voting. They're doing curbside voting for people for whom even really accessible polling places are going to be problematic, right? For someone for whom walking any length of distance, standing for any amount of time might be difficult to be able to vote from their car, but they are having an accessible vote by mail system. So it's really, or maybe they do a good job with both of those, but what Renaldo talked about, they've got like photo ID and proof of citizenship stuff that's a barrier before you're even able to register. So it's anywhere you go, we're seeing some really great practices and then some really problematic practices as well.
And James,
So that sounds like it kind of alludes. Oh, go ahead, Renaldo.
James, it's not even statewide. I mean, elections are ran by counties in Arizona, right?
Yeah.
So the administration of elections can be quite different in Greenlee County versus Maricopa County or Mojave County. So you're not just talking state laws, you're talking the administration of elections. And so, that's one of the things that we try to focus on is really looking at administration of elections. That's what I mentioned to you earlier when we talk with election officials, poll workers, making sure their poll workers are trained. That's going to be done at the county level, right? Making sure that the poll workers know how to work the machines, making sure the machines are on, right? So you have these administrations of elections that play a key part of this process. How's the check-in system? Do you have an electronic check-in system? Is your check-in system accessible for people with disabilities, right? Are your websites that you have information on, are they accessible? Is the information there? So there's so many different layers that we've talked about today that impact voting for voters with disabilities in general. I mean, just so many different levels. And trying to get all those levels on the same page, as Michelle says, sometimes it's pretty hard to get all of them on the same page. Just try to get as many as you can on the same page.
Yeah, I've sometimes done something as simple as called the water department, and depending on the day you call, or maybe your call gets cut off, and then you call back the next day and you ask essentially a different answer, right? So sometimes that has to do with, as you mentioned earlier, the training of the staff. But one thing that comes to mind is that we've had tremendous turnover in terms of poll workers, right? And so much of it has been tied to these recent years of distrust of the system, or people attacking poll workers and accusing them of things that they didn't do. And so you have people quitting and then other people coming on. And so you have to wonder, how well are the new people being trained, or were the people before maybe just more familiar because they had been doing it for years, and then now the new people aren't?
James, let me just real quick. It's not poll workers changing. In Arizona, don't quote me on this, but in Arizona, due to the climate, I think Arizona had an 80% change in election officials, not poll workers alone. We're talking election administrators, right? And we have a high turnover of poll workers, right? That's true, because we have so many poll workers. However, I think the issue is the county recorders, our election directors. Arizona, I think in the last 4 years, have maybe 80% change in election. We've had election officials that were in the position for 10, 20 years running elections. Due to the climate, they left, okay? So that's a concern.
You're not talking about 115-degree temperatures. You're talking about the political climate.
We're talking about the political climate. So when you have county recorders, election directors who run elections, nonpartisan elections, leave those positions, and some of those individuals during our last election were replaced, and we brought people in who never ran elections. We had some problems in one of our pretty populated counties. And so, we talk about laws, but we're also, I just want to keep reiterating, it's the administrators of elections. If they are changing, how much should we print ballots? How many ballots should we print? Selection of polling location, training of staff, right? All of these things play in, and we're not talking about like laws. We're talking about the administrations of elections.
Administration of the rules and the laws. Edgar, as a young voter, and by the way, how old are you, Edgar? How old are you?
I
Renaldo,
am 26.
26. Okay, so you're a young voter, and as you listen to this conversation or consider the political climate that we're in, how are you optimistic about this coming election in terms of just the process? Do you feel like it's going to be a smooth process for you and maybe your friends via social media or however? How do they feel about the process? Do they feel like it's going to be easy to vote or difficult?
Well, for those who are registered, they will be easier to vote. But if there's some that they're not, it makes it harder for them because they don't know where to go to vote, and they need someone who could guide them and explaining to them where they can go to vote, um, and which places and stuff like that. But I think if they can, maybe if they can provide like a locations where you can go vote and stuff like that, it might help them for some people who are new.
Mm-hmm. Does your county or state, do you think, do a good job of letting the community know, in particular people with disabilities, know
Hmm.
about accessible voting options?
I think they need to still work on it, like explaining to people, because there's hardly very many people who um are trying to see if they can register to vote. Um, because I voted before. I experienced it myself. I went there. I started voting when I was like 18, 19 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't that hard because for me, because of how I went there, and me and my mom went out to go vote, like in November, last November, the November of 2017, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
2017, 2018. So yeah, I experienced it before, and so what it makes it harder for most people now that they issued that there's some, like, the schools now, the schools, they're trying not to use a school ID. And
Oh,
so
I
people
see.
some people from the schools had a hard time without it because they don't know where to get, because they might need to get an ID from like the DMV or where they get their license and stuff like that.
Yeah. Do you, Michelle, or Renaldo, do your organizations have any kind of a hotline? Like when people confront what they think are just obviously sort of somehow the rules are just not being applied as they should be. Is there a way for people with disabilities to pick up the phone and ask questions and get
okay.
help?
During the election season, so in Arizona, we have early voting, right? So
Yes.
we take phone calls all through the year around voting, right? We get calls all the time about voting, but we have like an election cycle. And that election cycle usually starts 27 days before election day. So we'll start getting calls about different issues around voting, right? So I'm in the office, but on election day, right? I get to the
Yeah.
office at 5 o'clock in the morning and we have a hotline, and we promote that hotline throughout the community, right? So I'm gonna put a flyer together. Our Arizona Disability Voter Coalition partners will send a flyer out, social media, saying if you have any issues around election day, you give us a call, right? So, but before that election day, I reach out to our election officials and say, hey, I need direct access to someone in your office. If we get a call about a polling location, right? How are we going to do that, right? So
Mm.
the two major counties, Pima County and Maricopa County, I usually have direct contact either by a direct email or phone call and say, hey, I'm at a polling location. I just got a call. There's an individual wearing political attire, right? Or they just went to vote and the machine was off, right? Or they went there and there was a rude poll worker, or they went there, they couldn't vote because curbside voting because there was parking, people parked there. So I get on the phone, email, whatever I need to do. I'll call them through the hotline and we try to get that resolved, okay? The thing about the hotline, James, you don't get a second chance. In Arizona, if you haven't voted by 7 o'clock, or if you're not in line, the next time I'll see you at the next election. So our goal is through the hotline is to make sure we try to resolve those issues. And most of the time, we're able to resolve those particular issues. And sometimes we're not, then we'll address those issues after the election. But really the goal is to try to resolve those issues through the hotline. And so to answer your question, yes, we have staff here on the hotline, English and Spanish speaking staff during the hotline. That is correct.
Well, thank you. And thank you for pointing out that you have Spanish speaking staff. And let me ask before I go to you, Michelle, real quick, what kind of calls, who's calling you? Are these people, because of your organization, is it primarily people with disabilities, and do they say what kind of disability they're living with?
Yeah, well, what they do, to be honest with you, James, our numbers are out there, right? So sometimes people see our number, they call the number. And I would say on election day, 90% of our phone calls have nothing to do with disabilities. They just got our number, they saw it somewhere, and know what they asked them? Where's my polling location? What time do the polling close? We get those, right? But what are the calls we get in terms of the PAVA grant is, as I gave you earlier, accessible, the machines are not on, right? The polling location, bad parking, curbside voting isn't working. Those are the types of things that we get around. They're pretty routine, or we'll get a call, hey, I just went to vote and there was no signage. It was on a big campus. I had to walk a long way. There was not signage, right? Or the parking lot was not paved, inaccessible parking lot, or inaccessible polling location. The curb might have been, the ramp might have been too high. So we get all kinds of mixed bag calls throughout Arizona.
Michelle, so how do people get your help? Because and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard your organization described as kind of the ACLU on disability rights. I don't know if that's a fair assessment, but how do people get your help when they have a legal issue and a question?
All right, I'm an ACLU fan, so I'm very flattered by that description. So there's, I think, your best line of defense is going to be going to probably a state-specific resource first, since, like we talked about, voting is so state and local. So any of our organizations like Disability Rights Arizona should be able to take those calls. Some of them, like Renaldo said, will have a hotline specifically that they set up. But either way, you should be able to even just call the main office number. So if you go to ndrn.org and click on the link in the top left to find our organization in your state or territory, they're going to be able to assist you. There are some other good resources to know about, though, and one actually does sometimes lead to me. What I will say, there's two things actually we like about calling our organizations in the states. One, they're going to have state-specific info for you. But two, if you're a voter with a disability, these are folks in your state who specialize in disability access around voting. So they're going to have kind of the most specific information that you're looking for. Other than that, we are members of the Election Protection Coalition. That's that 866 Our Vote hotline, 866 OUR-VOTE. Important things to know about that. That's an English language hotline, but they partner with organizations that also offer the VE Vota hotline, which is Spanish and English. Another hotline that's Arabic and English, and another hotline that I'm not even going to try to name them all because I'll get it wrong, but it's English and about 9 different Asian languages. And it could vary what languages are included from year to year. So there's other language hotlines. There also tend to be other ways you can contact if a traditional phone hotline doesn't work for you, like texting or doing a chat through the website. One last one that I'll mention as well, National Association of the Deaf usually has a video chat hotline for speakers of ASL as well. So if you're looking to talk to someone kind of at the national level, or you are looking for different ways to contact someone, those are available as well. Election protection, the interesting thing about it is you'll probably get routed to your state. And then if they get a disability question that they're not sure how to answer, so if you call 866 Our Vote from Arizona, you'll probably get routed to folks in Arizona. And if you have a disability question they don't know how to answer, they're going to call Renaldo. And you're going to end up getting through to him either way.
And
if
we
you
are
have something really, if something gets escalated to the national level that's disability specific, you'll actually probably end up talking to me at some point. I hope not, because that means we weren't able to solve it before it got to me. Hopefully you never talk to me on election day. But that's an option as well. And I'll just say quickly, also, we're looking for 3 types of calls to come in, whether or not you're calling the PNA in your state or a hotline or whatever it may be. One is if you have questions before you go to vote. You can call and say, where's my polling place and is it accessible to me? What type of ID do I need? Are there transportation options to get me there? Whatever questions you have before election day, during early voting, on election day, before you go vote, and call those questions. The second that Renaldo talked about a lot that's really, really important is calling if you are trying to vote and you're not able to, right? I need the accessible machine and it's not set up or they won't let me use it. They won't let my service dog come in with me. They won't let me use the assistant of my choice. My polling place is not accessible, so that we can try to resolve that on election day so that you get to cast your ballot. Like Renaldo said, if you're not in line by 7 or whatever time polls close in your state, you're not going to get to vote. So we don't want you to leave and forfeit your vote. We want you to call. And we'll try to resolve that on election day. And then the third is calling after you voted or after election day to say, look, I was able to cast my ballot, everything's okay, but I saw something that wasn't right. And I want to report it and make sure someone knows about it, because maybe you go to your polling place and there's something wrong that's not accessible. Maybe they don't have the equipment set up and they're supposed to, but the poll workers are really nice and they offer to assist you to mark your ballot and you're okay with that. So you do that and you cast it and you leave. You got to vote, and that's priority number 1. But Renaldo wants to know where they didn't have the voting machine set up so that he can advocate for that to stop. So the next time you go to vote, the voting machine will be set up for you and you can actually vote with privacy and independence. So we want to see those 3 types of calls: questions you have before you vote, I'm being denied the right to vote, or I got to vote, but I want to tell you about something that I'm hoping you can advocate to get fixed next time.
Renaldo, we've got about 3 minutes left, and would you mind speaking to solutions, like what all of these issues that we've kind of spoken about? If you're out there and you're a person with a disability and you want to be part of the process of solving some of these issues to accessibility, what are a couple of solutions off the top?
Well, okay, so we're looking at access to voting, right? Access to the electoral process, right? So if you're a voter with a disability, one of the things, basically understand what your rights are as a voter, right? As a voter with a disability, and where you can get issues resolved, and how to set yourself up for best practice. So if you're a voter with a disability, if you live in the county, find out about the accessible voting machine, what type of machine you have in your county, right? So identify, see if there's a demo of that equipment. If you need accommodations, request those accommodations early, right? Request those, don't show up the day of voting. If you need large braille, or if you need large print. So you set yourself up as a voter for success, right? And also, if you are looking to participate in this process, the county is always looking to hire people. Go down and try to get a job at the county or at the state level. And so these are different things you want to do. But I really feel strongly, we talk about our Arizona Disability Voter Coalition, do your homework before the election, not on election day. Know where you're going to vote. So, and also, there's some great resources on the website, is make a plan to vote. There are some great, simple, make a plan to go. It talks about transportation, getting a ride to vote. You need somebody to help you. There's some really great resources on the website. I just saw a couple, make a plan to vote. If you follow that, you're likely going to be successful. That's kind of my 2 cents about it.
So I'm glad you closed there, because I mean, that's been a common refrain in recent years, and particularly this year, just the idea of have a plan, right? I'm going to vote. I want to vote. Don't just show up and on the day of and assume you're going to get all your questions answered in a timely manner. And definitely show up before the polls close. So, so that's advice.
Exactly.
I want to thank our guest, Renaldo Fowler. Thank you so much for being with us, Michelle Bishop and Edgar Zuniga, who is a young voter and also involved in disability issues there in Idaho. I'm going to share a note from Adrian Fuentes' office. They unfortunately got the time incorrect. He wanted to be with us. He's Secretary of State of Arizona, so we'll have to have him on at a different time. I'm going to pass the mic now to Armando Contreras, our CEO, for some closing thoughts, and then we'll see everyone else tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you, James. I just want to echo your gratitude to Michelle, Renaldo, and Edgar. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I want to thank James, too, for his contributions as a presenter and moderator during today's opening panels. I want to thank Alexis and Michael and our team for that whole Zoom coordination. Big thank you to the panelists, this panel and the panel that came on earlier. Honestly and truly, your insights and expertise have enriched our discussions, providing us with valuable perspectives that will undoubtedly guide UCP's ongoing efforts. And I'm incredibly grateful to our premier sponsor, Waymo, who was represented earlier today by Amanda Ventura Danny, as well as our supporting sponsors, Source America and Anchor. Your support is instrumental in making this event possible. And to everyone that participated today for joining us, thank you for making day one a resounding success.